Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this event as part of Georgetown's virtual reunion weekend. Right now, you're watching our Raising Resilient Children panel. A few points before we begin. Please use the chat function at any point during the panel to submit questions for the panelists. We will leave time at the end to answer some of these questions. Full bios for today's speakers are available on our reunion website. And a recording of this session will be available in the virtual attendee hub later today. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers today. First, we have Dr. Sandra Calvert, who is a Georgetown faculty member. She is a developmental and child psychologist whose scholarship illuminates the children's media area, including policy implications. She is currently a professor of psychology at Georgetown University and an affiliated faculty member at the McCourt School of Public Policy and the director of the Children's Digital Media Center. Next, we have Dr. Ashley Darcy-Mahoney, who is a 2006 graduate of the School of Nursing and Health Studies. She is celebrating her 15th reunion, and she is also a member of the Class 2006 committee, helping to host reunion this weekend. She is a neonatal nurse practitioner and director of infant research at George Washington University's Autism and Neurodevelopment Institute. Her research has led to the creation of programs that improve infant health and developmental outcomes for at-risk and preterm infants. Next, we have Erica Komisar. She is a 1986 graduate at the college celebrating her 35th reunion. She's also a parent of a 2021 graduate. She is a clinical social worker, psychoanalyst, and parent guidance expert who has been in private practice in New York City for over 30 years. She is the author of Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters, and is currently finishing her second book, which will be out this fall, on the topic of raising resilient, emotionally secure adolescents at an age of anxiety. Next, we have Dr. Cynthia Keysor, who is an 85 graduate of the college, celebrating her 35th reunion. She is a licensed psychologist within a private group practice. She practices from the belief that children want to do well, and when they're not, there's a reason that may be yet known or addressed. Dr. Keysor enjoys working collaboratively with parents and caregivers to help them understand and respond to their children's individual needs and to foster positive parent-child interactions. And finally, last but not least, we have Dr. Johnson, who is our moderator for today. She is a Georgetown faculty member. She's the Associate Director of the Department of Psychology at Georgetown University and co-director of the Child Development and Social Policy Lab. Across all of her research areas and projects, Dr. Johnson maintains a focus on barriers to early education and food access, as well as particular strengths of vulnerable subgroups of students and families. Thank you all for being here today. And now I will hand it off to our moderator, Dr. Johnson.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I hope you're enjoying your virtual reunion weekend. We're so delighted to be here and hopefully, excite you intellectually a little bit, challenge you to think particularly about some really contemporary issues that are affecting all of us, whether we are parents or caregivers or educators or just members of the community around this generation of children who's being raised amidst a disaster, which is really where the concept of resilience comes in. So I'm just starting with a slide because I think it's important to have a shared vocabulary and understanding of what is this construct of resilience that we're talking about. So this is not something that I created. There's a source credit at the bottom. This is something created by Professor Ann Maston, who is one of the kind of worldwide experts in defining and conceptualizing resilience. She's a professor at University of Minnesota. She wrote a paper in 2012 after another natural disaster, a hurricane in that case, and has recently followed up in 2021. This is her conceptualization of resilience. And I think it's just a really nice way to wrap your head around, like, what are we talking about? So the definition of resilience here is the capacity to withstand or recover from significant challenges that threaten development. And another way to think about this would be achieving better than expected outcomes given adversity or risk. And so I just modified this picture a little bit, adding a line there and a year on the x-axis, 2020, 2021, acknowledging that this acute trauma or disaster that this model can be applied to, in our case, is COVID. So that's that vertical line. And what you see is that gray, kind of grayed out horizontal rectangular area is on the y-axis, the kind of zone of adaptive functioning or zone of normal functioning. And you can imagine any outcome, right? We can talk about, and we will probably talk about children's social emotional behavior, children's cognitive and academic development, children's self-regulation, children's peer interactions and their own feelings about themselves, self-efficacy and confidence, tons of things on that y-axis. But whatever it is, imagine, there's a zone of kind of optimal functioning. And what resilience is, if you see where that vertical line falls exactly, is this idea of a recovery zone. Where do we see recovery after a disaster? So as you move along the x-axis away from that vertical COVID line, you see departure in children's outcomes. A bunch of those pathways, C, A, and B, for instance, stay within the zone of optimal or normal functioning, right? There may be kids who seem like they're not particularly affected by a disaster. That might be dotted line A. There may be kids who are initially kind of flat and then they actually thrive. They do quite well. That would be dotted line C. There may be kids who dip down and kind of succumb initially, but then come back up into a zone of optimal functioning as time goes on post-disaster. That would be dotted line B. But you can see that lines E and D in the bottom don't ever come into the recovery zone. And the longer away from the disaster, those are our kind of succumbers, the kids who post-disaster don't really achieve or withstand or recover from that challenge. So that's the definition of resilience. What explains children who end up in that red recovery zone versus kids who succumb after a disaster and end up outside of that recovery zone? So that's kind of the working model of resilience that I keep in mind when I think about this construct. I hope that's helpful to you too. So my job is to ask questions. It's a really easy job because I get to ask the questions and then you have this amazing deck of experts to answer them. So I'm going to start with a question now that we have this shared mental model of resilience. What is resilience? What risk factors do we think exist that disrupt children's resilience? So you can think about what are the risk factors that might put you in that lower D or E line outside of the zone of recovery? And how can we maximize our relationships with the children in our lives and their environments to build resilience? So that's my first question for the panel. And whoever wants to go first of the panelists can just volunteer and we'll go from there.
Well, I'll jump in on that one. When you think about resilience, and I love the way you've set the stage for us, it's so interesting that some children, when you look at them, seem to be able to flourish in this school of hard knocks. It's like they function even better than you would think they would given the situation. Whereas other ones seem to drop down and have trouble, basically coming back to where they need to be to function. So what is it that separates those kids? And some of it is genetic and some is environmental. Some kids have already faced trauma, but I think one of the biggest things that kids struggle with is stress. And the more they have ongoing stress in their lives, the harder it is, things that are like poverty or family relationships that aren't functional for them or other sorts of challenges. When something big happens like COVID, it's an environmental disruption, that some people are able to come back. And some of the things that I think are most important is they have secure families, among other things. They have attachments to mom and dad. They feel safe, even in the midst of stormy waters. And let me stop here and pass it on and let some other people, add to that.
So can I just add to what Sandra said and say that, we're not born with resilience. It's something that, and as Sandra said, there's research to show that children, a great number of children are born with a genetic sensitivity towards reacting to stress. And that means that they're more susceptible to things like anxiety and depression and ADHD-like symptoms in the future. But what the research shows is that if children have in 2 critical windows of brain development, 0 to 3, and then adolescence, which is 9 to 25, if they have what we call sensitive empathic nurturing, parents who are securely attached to them, but also help them to process their feelings. So I think in our culture, we're very confused about what self-sufficiency and independence, and we're confused about what separation means, because we associate separation with independence rather than interdependence. So children do need to develop resilience. They do need to, from the beginning, be given a little bit of space, be given a space to do things by themselves. But helping children to have space to do things by themselves, put on their shoes, put the napkins on the table, should not be confused with helping children to process their feelings. So we may encourage children to be a little more independent in their doing, but you don't want to abandon them with their feelings. They need parents as emotional regulators from the start to the finish of childhood.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just add on to that before we finish. So as was mentioned, my work is generally in the 0 to 3 space, so from infancy on forward. And so when we think about babies, right, this idea of resilience is really something that babies sort of gain over time, provided the right environment. It's the ability to adapt to adversity in a really healthy way. And while babies are certainly born with varying degrees of adaptability and sensitivity to their surroundings, the ability to cope and experience sort of stress and then cope with that stress is created by a constant, loving, comforting, secure presence of a parent or caregiver. It really generates this sort of healthy brain development that controls resilience and stress beginning very early on in life. We know that research has been done for decades, that resiliency really starts in early childhood. And as was mentioned, early adversities such as absence of a caregiver, neglect, maternal depression, really many types of things that can lead to this attachment being broken or not there or not as secure as a baby would want it to be, is an important sort of thought as we think about adversity in early childhood and as children experience it over time. That healthy and secure attachment is a first step in a really long emotional journey for self-regulation, resilience to stress, self-esteem, and having healthy relationships. So it does start very early in life.
Thanks. Well, you guys almost answered the second question. I think I'll read it out loud just to kind of consolidate our thinking. But, we touched on a lot of this, particularly Erica's comment. So the second question is, we say children are resilient in quotes, but this year has really tested this idea. So how do we help build and support resilience at different ages? Is the process similar or different at different ages? And I think Erica kind of alluded to this in her discussion of the 2 critical periods, the 0 to 3, which Ashley then, kind of deepened for us just now. And then this period of adolescence, 9 to 25, is protracted kind of, period of exuberant development in the brain. And so, the idea of, sensitive, empathic, available caregivers who can buffer children from the experiences of stress, kind of be those bumpers. You think about like playing bowling with little kids, the duck bowling, where you do the little ball and you have the bumpers on the side, and the ball is supposed to go fast, but it's supposed to kind of bounce off the sides and never go off the rails. And so what are the rails at, for very young children versus older children? And do you guys have thoughts on that?
There's a wonderful researcher, her name is Judy Mesman, and she traveled all over the world to look at mothering behaviors to see if they were universal or culturally relative, and she found that they were universal. But what she found is that babies in other parts of the world don't cry nearly as much as Western raised babies, because in other parts of the world, those babies are buffered from stress by being worn on their mother's bodies for the first year. So that skin to skin contact automatically protects that baby from the stress, right? So as Anna said, the brain isn't meant to experience great amounts of stress or separation from that primary attachment figure in the first year, and really in the first 3 years, incremental amounts of stress and frustration. And so, again, I go back to this idea that we impose on children in our culture, in our Western culture, we project onto children a kind of independence and self-sufficiency and resilience from the beginning. If there is such a word, I don't know, I think I sort of made it up. We adultomorphize children. And children are not like adults. We can't project onto them the ability to function in regards to stress the way that we function.
Yes, and I'm just going to jump in okay, if I can, to because one of the things I want to mention in the work that I do as a clinician, a lot of the individuals I see don't have that primary caregiver or parent who's able to be present for them. And just to remind people that it can be others as well. It could be, the coach or the pastor. Sometimes it's their friend's parents, right, who's kind of stepping into that role. Now, obviously, that what happens early on, completely support that. That's so important for children's development. But the reality is some children don't get that, or things disrupt it. Right? Maybe it's the death of the parent, or, something happens in the family and it's not able to be present and develop in that way. But resiliency, I see, is an ongoing process. And sometimes we can see children functioning in a very resilient manner, but later on at another time, the situation might be different and they might not have the same skills. And we have to kind of look at, do they have the skill set for that particular, incident to come back from it. But yes, I definitely support everything my colleagues have said, but I wanted to throw that in, that it can be others who step into that role sometimes, especially as kids get older.
If I could build on what Cindy is talking about, if you think about resilience, we have multiple backup systems for it, so that it's not just your mom, you have your dad, you have your grandparents, you have older siblings, you have your teachers, you have all these people in your world that help you. And one of the things that COVID has done is it's made it very, very difficult for those backup systems to be available in the same way they historically are. Because, your grandparents can't come and see you in person. So now they FaceTime the kids for shorter periods of time, but nonetheless that are meaningful. So you have to kind of look at what sort of backup systems put so much more pressure on parents. And moms, I think, have been especially overwhelmed trying to deal with all this pressure. And one last thing I'd like to just point out is these sensitive periods are extremely important. The first 3 years, the adolescence, but you also have early childhood and middle childhood, where those kids are being affected by COVID and other stressors as well. It may not be as impactful as it might for somebody else, but even adults, turn to their parents in times of stress, if you're having problems, who do you call? A lot of times people call their moms and dads to talk issues through. So attachment is a lifelong process. It's extremely important for all of us in terms of well-being, and it gets passed on from one generation to the next.
Yeah, and that was a question that was just in the chat that Dr. Johnson answered a bit, but I'll sort of add on to it. So in thinking about, how parents and caregivers react to stress in light of, and sort of then the reaction of the child, I know in pediatrics, we often think about children and adolescents as an emotional barometer for their families, and they often reflect the level of stress of their parents and caregivers. We absolutely see that in babies, but we also see that in children in general. From infancy through adolescence, children pick up on cues, both overt cues and implicit cues that are displayed by their caregivers. And I think, now certainly while children have been separated from loved ones, perhaps primary caregivers like grandparents or aunties or other members of the family community that may have served as that primary caregiver, it's certainly something that we've seen, like Dr. Calvert was saying, we really bear the burden has been bared by children and moms largely in this particular capacity.
Can I just say something about, because I do see something in the chat box and it sort of connects to what you're all saying about generational expression, about modeling and how parents or caregivers model. What we know from the research, I mean, I always lean heavily into research because I try never to say anything. Sometimes I'll say things from my practice, but, and anecdotally from my practice, but mostly from research. And what I would say is that the research is very clear that there is generational expression of mental health issues, meaning it's called it's called the inheritance of acquired characteristics, that we inherit things by observing our parents. We can inherit things genetically, but usually mental illness is not inherited genetically. It's inherited by living with a depressed parent, living with an anxious parent. So yes, as parents, we do model how our children cope with stress, with adversity. And so this is why I always encourage parents to go into therapy themselves. If they are struggling to regulate their own emotions, it's very hard, very, very challenging as a parent to help to regulate your children's emotions if you struggle with regulating your own emotions.
Yes, and I'm going to add to that if I can, and how important, the ability to regulate emotions is as part of this process of becoming resilient, right? That's a big part of it. But I'll certainly learning other skills as well. But kids do feed off of their parents' emotions. Even young, infants can feed off the stress of a parent. And sometimes parents aren't aware of their own emotions. And I think one of the things that maybe happened over COVID, we were in a situation where, the people who might typically help their children, handle stress were feeling stress as well, right? We were all in this boat of feeling, dealing with this pandemic and having to find our own resources sometimes to be able to help ourselves or others, manage things. But regulating that emotion is so critical. And a lot of times, parents will say, well, I don't want them to keep yelling, but the parent, him or herself is yelling. And so we've got to be aware of what are we modeling and what are we expecting? What messages are we sending? Is it a do as I, say, not as I do? Because that's not really helpful or positive, for that relationship or for the development of that resilient process.
And I think those are excellent comments. And I want to be aware of one of the things that I think has come out a lot in the popular media. And for this week, we certainly would invite Dr. Calvert to chime in as media, children's interaction with media and family interaction with media is her area of expertise. So Sandy, I invite you to correct me if I say something that's not quite right. But, I think in the popular media, we have seen a lot of blame resting on parents and caregivers. And I think we should be careful when we think about, the notion that, to use Dr. Komisar's examples from before, the notion that, like we don't hold our babies enough when they're little and that's why US babies cry more, or the notion that, which is something that, has been said many times. I'm just using that as an example. Or the idea that, like that mental illness is, modeled or, observed. There are strong genetic components to many mental illnesses, like depression, anxiety, bipolar, and schizophrenia, for instance. But I think in this time of, the current pandemic and the fact that parents are under stress, and this goes back to one of the questions in the chat, how can parents, and this is also a question we have later in our list, how can parents fill their own cups? How can parents take care of themselves? Not blaming parents and saying, if you don't take care of yourself, your child's potential, increased risk for not being in that recovery zone is your fault. But saying, how can we support parents and caregivers so that they can help support children? And I don't know, if the panelists have any thoughts on that. It's kind of combining some of the questions as well as a comment.
Yeah.
But it's kind of, I think it's something that seems to be coming up in the both the chat and the things you guys are saying.
And I can jump in there to start, if that's okay. one of the things I think sometimes parents need is the permission to take care of themselves. And, you know, how do they juggle that? You know, when their children need this, or their spouse or partner need that, or their parents need something, their job, you know, there's so many demands on parents, and, you know, how do you find the time and prioritize that? But I really do stress to parents the significance of caring for themselves. If you don't care for yourself as a parent, you're not going to have anything to give to others, and you can grow resentful. So whether it's, you know, I'm going to get 20 minutes to go read a chapter of my book, or take a walk, or take my run, you know, whatever it is you enjoy, to realize you deserve to have that time as well. And, you know, it only serves everyone better in the long run, as well as yourself. And so I encourage parents to also support that for one another. If, you know, if they're, you know, in a partnership or marriage, so that they're each getting that as well.
I mean, I'm going to also say that, you know, just to operationalize some of the things that we're talking about, you know, sleep is a big thing. And I think often parents get confused because they're caring for their children, you know, all day long. And then they say, right, I'm going to stay up really late because that's going to be my time for myself. And what they don't realize is that, you know, I always say to, because I see mothers and caregivers with very young children, and I say, you have to sleep when your children sleep. Something as simple as that, you know, and, you know, you have to be efficient about the time that you take for yourself. So, you know, and I agree with Cindy that, you know, exercise is really important to reduce stress for parents. So that can't be taken off the table. But sleep shouldn't be underrated as something that's really important and that you want to do when your children do it.
If I could just add to that, I think these are great comments. I'm a big advocate of exercise. It does help reduce stress. I also think there is what we could call the good enough parent that's in the literature, that especially Georgetown graduates, I know from having years and years of worked with you, there's a real perfectionist kind of belief that I'm going to be the perfect parent. I'm going to do everything just right. And none of us are perfect. And so it's, you know, there's permission to be a person, but there's also forgiving yourself for maybe not doing your best job, you know, that you could have done in another circumstance because you don't have the backup system that you normally do. So that sort of thing of being able to gauge your own emotions about, you know, am I getting to the point where my temper is starting to build internally, and deal with your own emotions, take a little time out for yourself, you know, read something, you know, that you don't have to be there all the time. It's the quality of time that matters the most. And when you're with your kids 24/7, your kids need a little independent time as well. So, you know, the point is to be there and be responsive when your kids really need you, but also to foster their own sense of being able to do some things independently. So you can have a little time yourself.
I mean, can I just add one more thing to that, which is I agree with what you said. And the idea that we always have little bits of separation from our children, whether it's, you know, going to the bathroom to take a pee when, you know, our child needs us and, you know, you gotta have to wait a second, I gotta go to the bathroom, to going to exercise, or the issue is not that we have little separations from our child or our children, it's processing it with your child. And I think what happens is parents feel guilty when they have any separation at all. So they'll run out without saying goodbye, or they'll treat the separation not with the degree of respect that it requires. So there's a very famous analyst named Ed Tronick, and he talks about the importance of repair. So when you do exercise, when you do take a half an hour for yourself to do self-care, or take a hot bath, or go for a walk, or whatever, that you have to talk to your child about it before you leave, and then you have to process it with them when you come back. And then the child can handle it. So children can handle frustration, but not if we treat it with disrespect.
Yeah. And I was just going to add too, from what you were just saying, Erica, is that, you know, I think one of the things as parents that we sometimes do is we rescue our children from the opportunity to feel and learn how to manage their emotions. Because as parents, we don't want to see our children hurting, right? And so sometimes we do whatever it takes so they're not hurting or, sad or whatever. But I think it is important what you're saying is, have that conversation. And teach them that their feelings are certainly okay. Some feelings get a bad rap, right? Usually it's anger, for example, because of how it's expressed sometimes. But I like to reassure people, all feelings are okay. It's how we express them sometimes that can get us in trouble. So we want to be careful about that. But when we fix something, a situation for children, and we don't give them the opportunity to feel, what they're feeling, they don't learn how to be comfortable with their feelings and manage them. And, one example that comes to mind is, if the pet dies and how sad the child is, sometimes parents want to run out and get another replacement pet right away. And, they're not allowing their child to process the feeling that comes with the loss of their pet and even why they're feeling that. So that's a big part of emotion regulation that I think is important as well. But parents have to also be comfortable with their own emotions to tolerate that.
I just want to highlight something that Erica said that I think is really, really interesting, exciting, and important. And it's another R word, and it's the word repair. And so when I introduced the idea of resilience and we talked about the recovery zone, I think what happens in the middle there is repair. And maybe the answer to some of these questions is micro challenges, micro repair, micro recovery in daily interactions that then build the capacity for bigger repair, bigger recovery when the big R resilience shock comes along. That's kind of what I'm hearing from you guys. I don't know if that resonates with anyone.
Yeah, so I've been mothering two very small children during this pandemic, 3 and 5, and it's been something, right? As probably a bunch of you on here have dealt with children of varying ages. And I think one of the things that we've been talking about a little bit, or sort of at least circling around the subject, is this idea of children's efficacy and increasing a child's self-efficacy. And so during during tumultuous times, giving children this sense of control, especially those sort of like toddlers, as some of you all know, who may have had toddlers or have toddlers, giving a choice, giving them some self-agency, even if that choice is probably a predetermined choice that you want them to make. Like, do you want broccoli or carrots? The question is, what vegetable are you going to eat tonight, right? But the choice is, which one of these would you like to have for dinner? Giving kids this self-control especially during a time of fear or uncertainty, allows them to assert some control, right? And play this sort of active role. So, during this pandemic, washing our hands, putting on a mask, right? Those have been disruptions to children. So what mask would you like to wear? Is there a kind of hand sanitizer that's exciting for you? We could get the Spider-Man one in the store, or we could get the Superman one. Just things like that, understanding that we may not be able to be with a family member, but we could go and make a dinner together and leave it on their front door, right? These are things that give children this sense of control, even very young children. So I'm really, this can definitely translate into school age and adolescence, but it can absolutely be true for early toddlerhood as well.
If I could build briefly on what Cindy had to say earlier about rescuing our children from stress, because or situations where you never want them to suffer. And, and I think that one thing is that it's okay to let kids figure it out sometimes. There are hard knocks in life, and you don't want to, just throw them out there so that they have no protection. But at the same time, you want them, in terms of building resilience, to have little opportunities, these micro things that Anna is talking about, to be able to successfully navigate situations so that, as Ashley puts it, they take control, that they have efficacy over their own lives, and they feel like that they can take care of themselves. And you want them, again, you want to make demands of children that are maturity demands. It's like, at what age should my child be able to do X, Y, or Z? Some of that is age appropriate, but also it's child appropriate and situation appropriate. And right now, you see them struggling more. And so you lend them a hand more. And last kind of thing actually that you brought up is the Spider-Man, Superman. One set of friends that kids do have now that they've had all along and that change a bit over time is they have their friends on television or online that they continue to see, and they have strong emotional feelings for them. They're called parasocial relationships. And the stronger they have relationships with them, the better they learn from them. And they talk to them and interact with them when they're little, and and that increases learning. So this has been an underutilized resource that parents could take advantage of, and also pull in things like puppets and play with their kids, because that helps build stronger emotional relationships. So you have these symbolic characters, and one that I could just throw out is somebody Erica, I think, is very familiar with, is Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Mr. Rogers, who had this huge heart and was always there for kids. And he told kids that their parents loved them just the way they are. Last thing, and then I'm going to stop, is that parents sometimes think that if you leave your child with somebody in media who is good for you, that they can go off and take the time. When they're little, they need you there beside them to help them understand the content. Otherwise, it often goes over their head. Repetition helps, but you also use it as a resource rather than as a babysitter.
I just want to add to that and say that I think you can hear from this discussion that what we're trying to get away from is the binary nature of this paradigm, that we neither want to protect our children from all frustration, nor do we want to impose on them frustration that they cannot tolerate. And I think what's happening today, to skip a little bit, because as Anna said, my first book was about early childhood, but let's skip to adolescence. We project onto adolescents, school-age and adolescent children, too much frustration in many ways. We expect of them, and maybe as Georgetown grads, I can't remember who said it, that we're all perfectionists. And I also live in New York City and treat people in New York City, so full of perfectionists. But what I will say is that we expect so much of children, things that weren't expected of my generation. I mean, I graduated in '86. I say I would never have gotten into Georgetown University today. And I wouldn't be successful in the way that it is perversely defined, because it's so much harder to be a young adult and adolescent today, and we expect too much of them, extracurriculars, test scores, grades in school. So we also have to be careful on the other end of the spectrum that we're not projecting too much onto them.
Yes, and I think that's a great point, and it makes me think of what I wanted to mention earlier and forgot, which is how important it is for us as parents to really communicate with our children, and to remember that a big part of communication is not just the talking, for example, but the listening as well, and trying to really hear what our kids are telling us in terms of how they're feeling, and you can reflect on that feeling and validate that feeling, because if we jump in and want to just fix a problem, it will shut down communication typically pretty quickly. But if we can validate their feelings and show them that we understand, then they usually let us in a little bit more and more as we go. And it's okay if we don't get the feeling right. Even as a clinician, I don't always, get it right, but they correct me, and that's okay. So being able to, have that opportunity, and to also remember that when we're communicating in our relationships, whether it's with our kids, our partner, our spouse, that it doesn't always have to be verbal, right? Many kids communicate or like to communicate by little notes with their parents back and forth. That's a way sometimes where they feel comfortable sharing how a struggle they're having or something they did at school that they think they're going to get in trouble for. So they write it down. And for parents who tend to be reactive, I encourage that, because it gives parents time to also absorb what's happened, absorb the message, and then be calm enough to go then have conversation. But there's also dance and music, art, all kinds of ways that people communicate, and to encourage that as well if your child is someone who isn't readily, comfortable just talking. And play, certainly, for the young ones too.
Thanks, Cindy. This has been a really rich conversation. I have to say, if you guys could see what I see, which is our kind of map of questions, we've kind of meandered through all of them, right? So our big topics were what's resilience? How do we help parents fill their cups so that they can take care of children? What about, children consuming media and how can media support healthy development? Sandy touched on that. And then what best practices can parents and guardians implement to help their children transition to a new normal? I think we've kind of set ourselves up for that question, which also goes along with, for the panelists who are following along, the question about supporting children's emotional well-being, which was question number 3. So I'm going to combine question number 3 and 6, since we've touched on almost everything else, and ask you guys, what best practices can parents, guardians, teachers, caregivers implement to help children transition to the new normal that's coming up? And particularly, how can we support their emotional well-being?
I think I'd like to go back to listen to what children are saying, because they have so many feelings about what's going on in their lives now, and just be, an active listener and try to structure situations so that kids feel secure, so that they feel safe, and so that they know that there's nothing that they can do that will make you not love them. Because I think that sometimes, when you get really stressed out, you worry that, gee, am I still lovable if I'm acting out because I'm under all the stress as a kid? And so I lose my patience. And so for parents to be sensitive, warm, responsive, basically fostering, and teachers as well, fostering that secure attachment, and also trying to get them back out in their peer group, maybe through organized sports, playing t-ball or soccer, or at older ages, just thinking about that, the sports world itself, I think, is one that really provides a structure and organization. But you also have churches and other sorts of activities and groups that I think that kids need to get back out into their peer groups, especially as they're getting older. They need those peers more and more.
Yeah, so it's some of the things that I tell parents, especially of young kids, is when creating this sort of safe physical and emotional environment that we're getting back into. I talk about 3 R's: reassurance, routine, and regulation, again, especially with like young children. So reassuring children, again, especially young children who, depending on how their parent or caregiver has framed our current environment, going back to school, going back to soccer, may be different for different children, depending on what they've heard on the news, what they've seen, and how their families have maintained discussion around this during the pandemic. If you put your mask, if children have been told to put their mask on so they don't get a disease, a virus, a germ, whatever, then taking it off might feel unsafe to them. And so reassuring them about their safety, the safety of their loved ones, that it's our job as adults to ensure their safety. So what does that mean? And that includes explaining, again, I have a 3-year-old, and we've talked about that, you don't have to wear your mask outside anymore, because the scientists have done really great science to show us that we probably won't get these germs outside, right? They understand that. Children understand what that means. Then regulating a lot of what we've talked about here, of sort of understanding feelings and responses to stress, including breathing and yoga and whatever else you like to do with your kids. And then routine, maintaining a daily schedule that's predictable, regular bedtimes, regular meals, daily schedules for learning and play. Kids really thrive on those. So, if I have a take home, those are sort of the 3 R's that I like to lead parents with during these times, and creating safe spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Can I also bring up the fact that children, you can't ask a child, you can't even ask an adolescent, often, what are you feeling? How are you, why are you doing what you're doing? I always say to parents, get rid of that question, why? Children don't necessarily have the ability to be self-aware of how they're feeling, to mentalize, meaning to think about their feelings. So as parents, that's your role. is to mentalize, in social work school, I'm a psychoanalyst, but first I was a social worker, and in social work school, we used to call it putting another person's feelings into words. And it means using your imagination to imagine empathizing, putting yourself in your children's shoes and imagining what they're feeling, and not asking them why they're doing what they're doing, or paying attention to their social cues, their body language, their actions, which is, children's language is action. And so helping them to put what you think is happening to them into words. And that's mentalizing, right? Using your imagination to put their feelings into words. And that's a critical part of, what Sandra called listening. You can listen to people's words, but with children, you really have to reach for their feelings.
Yeah. I'm just going to add too, when we think about, our kids going back and, back into their old routines, or, meeting friends again, going back to school. A lot of parents have concerns about having to do that now too, going back to work, and so that is very true. Think about how you're feeling if you're in that position, or how are you feeling about going to meet your friend and eating in a restaurant, and to understand that your children, can have some of those concerns as well. But I think one of the messages I want to send out is the importance of remembering that there's going to be adjustment that has to happen. There has to be time given for us to adjust, the same way we had to adjust to, doing telehealth, or, working from home, or whatever it was, that changed in our lives, being together, everyone, for so long, right? There had to be some adjustment, and there's going to be that needed as well. And I think giving people the space to do that, and to be patient with people, and to help our children understand that they might be really excited, for example, to go back to school, but they might have a classmate or two who's not so sure about it. And how can they be supportive of that classmate? How can they be kind, right? But I think, understanding it's a process to get there.
Any other? Oh, Sandy, go ahead.
Just quickly to build on what Cindy's saying, their teachers may also be scared. The teachers may be more scared than the kids are, because some of the teachers are older. And so, it's one of those things where I think all of us as a society are just going to have to kind of cut some slack to everyone around you, and just realize that people right now have been under a prolonged period of stress, where they have been isolated, and where they have had, just this unprecedented pandemic impacting their lives, where people are worried about, am I going to die? Are my kids going to die? Are my parents going to die? I mean, what's going to happen from one day to the next? I frankly think we're very fortunate that the vaccines have been effective, and that we're on embarking on, not just our country, but worldwide, doing some activities to get people who are going to be safer. But I also believe that we need to be patient, and there's some people who are going to want to continue to wear masks, and I think that that's okay. So I think that people just have to give everyone else a little more flexibility right now, and realize that we've got to transition back.
Can I just say something too about the fact that it's not all doom and gloom for all families? And so for a lot of families, I wrote a lot of articles in the beginning of COVID talking about how for very young children whose parents were not, overwhelmed, and that's to say many people were, but, whose parents could really make use of this time that they didn't have with their children before, and they were making use of having their children there to really spend a lot of time with them. So I called COVID a magnifier. If your family dynamics were very healthy, it magnified the health of that. If there was disruption, dysfunction, if there was conflict in the family, it magnified that too. So for a lot of very young children, COVID was a very good thing. It allowed children to be with their parents in a way that, parents who worked two working parent families who worked full time and only saw their kids for an hour each day, unless it was on the weekend. These kids were now around their parents. So what we have to think about is it's going to be hard for those children to go back to school because they've enjoyed the time being with their parents. It's hard to see their parents go back to work in offices.
And I'd also like to just raise one thing that we haven't said, perhaps in light of some of us here on the panel, but this time has been tumultuous for lots of children, but especially for Black children. And racism, we haven't touched on. We've talked about COVID, but certainly we haven't talked about the George Floyd and all of the things that have happened over the past 18 months. And racism affects child health. It affects resiliency. It affects all of the things that we're talking about today. And so just in thinking about the goal of helping all children reach their full potential, I think we have to think about the impact that racism has on child and adolescent health, and the progress that we all need to keep making on racial equality and the impact of racism on community of color. So I just felt like we sort of didn't touch on that, but it seemed like something that is really important right now in this same topic.
Thank you, Ashley, for raising that. I think that's an excellent point. You know, I think to kind of combine that with Erica's point, you know, there's a lot of strength in communities of color during this time, and some of the most resilient processes that I've seen in some of the research that I'm doing, which is exclusively with low-income families who are, in my particular research sample, 60% Latinx and 30% Black. So it's majority minority sample. In my own research, what we're seeing is really strong protective processes among Black and Brown households around the maintenance of family rituals, cultural traditions, and celebrations, kind of offsetting the isolation from peers. So multi-generational families, multi-generational households, things that we might have had more of a, you know, as a society had been projected as a deficit perspective. And it's true that communities of color have been hit harder by COVID. You know, and I think it's important to acknowledge that that there's some really unique kind of culturally specific strengths that have carried a subset of these families through this time. So acknowledging both of those things, like the really, you know, health detrimental effects of structural racism and the fact that we're seeing greater, you know, disproportionate deaths and, you know, economic disruption among households of color. And at the same time, when we think about resilience factors and like what makes some of those families end up in that zone of recovery, for households, communities of color, you know, there are some really unique strengths that I think should be kind of raised up. So I'm seeing some comments in the chat just at the very end. We have, just 5 minutes left. So if people want to unmute or ask questions, if panelists have any, last thoughts they want to share, this would be the time for that.
Also, Anna, I was thinking you should put your figure back up, you know, when Erica started talking about the families that are flourishing and the families that are bottoming out, and that, you know, what is it about those family systems that is allowing some to succeed? I think, the strength of the church in so many Black families is one of the things that holds the glue together for them. But I also think there is so much variability in the family in terms of how they are responding to COVID, and then how they're going to re-enter. And I want to mention the careers of women, with women with young children. While in some ways it's been, a good thing for kids to have their moms more, women with high-powered careers have really struggled, again, this perfectionism thing, to do it all, to try to do their careers while they're also raising very small children and not having those external supports that they typically can depend on. So I think that's another group that I am concerned about as we re-enter from the pandemic.
Maybe I can have my last words on Sandra's, which is, I always write about this. We can do it all as women in life. We just can't do it all at the same time. And I'm not the first person to say that. But, and that's a really important thing, because as our children need us when they're very young, and I'm going to say my second book is about adolescence coming out in the fall. Your children need you as adolescents very much, just in a different way than when they were little. And I think we get confused about that. We think because they seem so independent and they seem to shut their door and not to want you around, they actually do need you. And if you're not there when the door opens, then the door closes again and you don't have another opportunity, because you can't do it on your time. You have to do it on their time. So then you don't have another opportunity till the door opens. So if you're not around enough. So I do say that, you know, if you're going to have a powerful career and, you know, you can do it. You just can't do it as effectively when you have very young children or even adolescents. I mean, you have to leave time for your children if you want them to be resilient. You have to be there enough.
Yeah, a couple of people have asked for resources in the chat box. A bunch of us have been putting them in, so I would encourage you to take a look. I know that Dr. Calvert has said there's a lot of media resources. Shout out to Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers, Daniel Tiger. Those are some of the big ones that talk about a lot of these, especially for young kids. But there's been a lot in the chat for resources for talking and thinking about some of this. So grab it while it's still there.
And I posted a link to a podcast, and I acknowledge that it's my best friend from graduate school, but it's a terrific podcast. It's very, very popular. If I didn't recommend it, you might have heard about it on your own. It's called Raising Good Humans, and it's available wherever you get your podcasts. And she covers everything from babies through, you know, emerging adulthood with really targeted advice. So some of the questions that came up in the chat, she has a whole podcast on what to do when your kid doesn't want either of the two vegetable options you've been offered. And it tracks very closely to what you recommend, Ashley.
So if I could just mention a couple of other programs that are more recent. Of course, there's the historic Sesame Street, but Eleanor Wonders is an amazing program for kids. And so is Don Quixote, which it just makes me laugh out loud sometimes when I'm watching it. So it appeals to, you know, adults as well as kids in terms of humor. But there, if anybody wants to reach out, there, you know, Common Sense Media has a great list of things, and Sesame Street via PBS and all kinds of PBS programs became more available during the pandemic. And Google also created Play Store where there are teacher approved apps, and I actually worked on that with them. So there are a lot of resources that emerged in media during the pandemic, and that's something that hopefully we'll take more advantage of in the future.
Well, it's exactly 11 o'clock, so I just want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank Dr. Calvert, Dr. Keysor, Dr. Komisar, Dr. Darcy-Mahoney, everyone who was here, wonderful panelists, really practical advice, tons of good resources in the chat, which you can save. We can also download it and post it wherever reunion resources are available. Thank you so much for being here. Enjoy the rest of your reunion activities.